Pass the sugar, will you, doll?
It's about time they served real coffee.
Beats the jungle rations anyway.
August 1945. A humid afternoon settles over a remote Allied camp in the Philippines. A convoy halts at the wire gate, trucks carrying a small group of Japanese prisoners. But these are not soldiers. They are women. Some wear faded khaki uniforms once marked with the crimson sun. Others are in simple field clothes, sleeves torn, faces thin from hunger and exhaustion. Their eyes do not meet those of their guards. As they are escorted through the camp, a sound reaches them. Laughter. They turn. Under the shade of a mess tent, Allied men and women sit together at long wooden tables. Nurses in crisp uniforms pour coffee. Soldiers, relaxed and weary, share cigarettes and bread. A man hands a woman a metal cup. She smiles, and they drink together. The Japanese women freeze. Their training had taught them that a woman's place was behind, beneath, unseen. Yet here, men and women shared the same space, the same meal, the same humanity. For the first time, the boundaries of their world begin to tremble. They had entered captivity, but what they were witnessing was something far more disarming. Freedom. To understand the quiet shock of that moment, one must return to the world these women came from, the Japan of the 1930s and early 1940s, where duty and discipline reigned above all else. From childhood, Japanese girls were taught a single, unwavering code, onanomichi, the way of the woman. It meant obedience, modesty, and service to men. In schools, they memorized the Greater Learning for Women, a moral guide written centuries earlier, still taught under the militarist state. It declared that a woman's highest virtue was loyalty, first to her father, then to her husband, and ultimately to the emperor. When Japan expanded across Asia, this loyalty became a weapon of war. As soldiers marched into China, Burma, and the Pacific, thousands of women followed. Nurses, clerks, teachers, typists. They were the invisible machinery of the empire, serving in hospitals, supply bases, and field stations. By 1944, women's auxiliary units had been formed within the Army and Navy, though still under male command. Their uniforms were crisp, their duties endless. Every textbook, every broadcast, every poster carried the same message. The emperor was divine. Japan was destined to rule Asia, and surrender, for anyone, was shame beyond redemption. Even civilians were expected to die before capture. This ideology was not abstract. It was enforced. On Saipan in 1944, Allied troops watched in horror as entire families, mothers holding children, threw themselves from cliffs to avoid falling into enemy hands. Women had been told that Americans were monsters, violators, mutilators, eaters of flesh. The propaganda left no room for mercy, only fear. So when Japan's vast defensive ring began to crumble in 1944 and 1945, the capture of female personnel became something extraordinary. For many, it was a fate worse than death, a living humiliation. Among them were Army nurses stationed in Manila and naval auxiliaries in Guam, who had tended to wounded soldiers until the very last gun fell silent. When the surrender orders came, some chose suicide. Others, wounded and weakened, were too exhausted to resist. Allied forces, trained to expect fanatic resistance, were astonished to find Japanese women alive among the prisoners. These first encounters were uneasy. The captives bowed deeply, refusing food and water, whispering apologies for their failure. Some refused to look their captors in the eye. Allied medics, often Australian, American, or Filipino, treated them for malaria, burns, and malnutrition. The women sat rigidly, hands folded, unable to understand why they were being helped instead of harmed. For Allied personnel, it was a rare sight. Until 1945, Japanese women had almost never been seen in captivity. For the Japanese themselves, this moment was a fracture in the sacred myth of the nation, proof that even loyalty could not overcome reality. Across the Pacific from New Guinea to the Philippines, Allied intelligence began documenting these cases. Female prisoners were questioned, not with hostility, but with curiosity. Who were they? How had they lived? What did they believe? The answers painted a haunting picture of indoctrination and devotion, a society where the state had reached into the most private corners of life. One report from an Australian camp described the women as meticulously polite, but terrified of dishonor. Another noted that they refused to speak unless ordered by a superior, even when no superior existed. Behind barbed wire, the empire's invisible hierarchy still lingered. But outside those fences, the world was changing fast. Allied women, nurses, officers, clerks, worked alongside men with confidence and a quality unimaginable in the Japanese military. To the captives, this reality seemed not only foreign but impossible. They had been told the enemy was savage, uncivilized, without virtue. Yet here, men and women spoke freely, shared duties, even laughed together. This dissonance between the world they had been raised in and the one they now saw was the beginning of an awakening. For now, though, they were simply prisoners. Their empire was collapsing, their emperor still silent, and their understanding of honor hanging by a thread. The next months would confront them with new lessons, not of war, but of humanity. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly. The Imperial Japanese Navy lay shattered after Leyte Gulf, and U.S. forces pressed through the Philippines with relentless momentum. Cities were bombed, ports blockaded, and isolated garrisons left to fend for themselves. Within this chaos, the fate of Japanese women, those who had once supported the war effort from hospitals, offices, and coastal outposts, became increasingly precarious. In Manila, nurses and clerical staff were trapped between the retreating Japanese military and advancing Allied units. Supplies ran low. Food disappeared. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion claimed more victims than bullets. Some women were evacuated on small boats or forced into overland treks, only to be captured by Allied patrols. Others, too weak to flee, were found hiding in makeshift shelters, often alongside wounded soldiers. Meanwhile, Allied forces struggled to integrate these women into a system designed primarily for male POWs. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, medical care, and protection from abuse. Obligations now applied to individuals who, for much of their lives, had been taught that capture itself was dishonor. Allied officers and medics, aware of cultural sensitivities, created separate accommodations within the camps, but full segregation was impossible. The arrival of Japanese women introduced an unprecedented tension, fear mixed with fascination. Guards observed strict bowing, extreme politeness, and nervous glances. Some captives refused to eat in front of men, even when starving, hiding behind folds of blankets or camp walls. Others attempted to maintain uniforms meticulously, as though their attire alone could preserve dignity. Every gesture was laden with meaning, rooted in decades of indoctrination about shame, obedience, and the sanctity of the emperor. Allied medics and camp administrators quickly realized that cultural understanding was essential. They provided language lessons, instructions in camp routines, and gentle encouragement to accept food and rest. Red Cross representatives visited, often bringing letters and small comforts, bridging the vast divide between the women's indoctrinated fears and the unexpected generosity of their captors. The contrast could not have been starker. In the Japanese worldview, men and women occupied fixed, sacred spaces. Social interaction across gender lines was formal, limited, and hierarchical. Here, in the Allied camps, those rules were absent. Women observed nurses and clerks working alongside men, sharing responsibilities, exchanging stories, even laughing. Meals were communal. Daily life, previously regimented by strict codes of honor and obedience, now appeared spontaneous, free, and profoundly bewildering. At the same time, the captives faced the practical realities of survival. Food rations were modest but steady, and medical care, for the first time, was unconditional. Those suffering from disease or injury received treatment without judgment. Letters from home were delayed or non-existent, yet the assurance of safety, however strange, offered a fragile comfort. Reports from Australian and American camps reveal that many women experienced intense psychological disorientation. Some whispered that they had expected cruelty only to find kindness. Others questioned the stories they had been told of the enemy, stories of barbarism, rape, and cruelty, and found them inconsistent with what they saw. A few admitted, years later, that the camp was the first place they had felt truly alive since the war began. This cultural collision set the stage for the most profound moments of the women's captivity. It was not bullets or explosions that would test them, but a slow, quiet confrontation with a world that operated on entirely different rules. A world in which men and women could eat together, work together, and exist as equals. A concept both alien and irresistible. The broader context of the war, Japan's military collapse, the devastation of cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Allies' logistical dominance, only intensified the psychological impact. The women were witnesses to a dual reality: the physical defeat of their country and the emotional unraveling of beliefs they had been trained to uphold. It was in these moments, between barracks and mess halls, between medical tents and guard posts, that the first seeds of understanding took root. They watched, listened, and sometimes in private dared to question. And as the war approached its final days, one act, simple, almost mundane, would crystallize all of these tensions. One act that would forever mark the boundary between fear and comprehension, duty and humanity, captivity and freedom. The story of Japanese women prisoners in Allied camps is not a single narrative. It is a prism reflecting multiple perspectives: cultural, psychological, tactical, and humanitarian. To understand their shock, one must examine these angles in detail. For Japanese women raised under the strict codes of imperial ideology, life was a rigid hierarchy. Obedience, modesty, and sacrifice were not merely virtues. They were laws of existence. Within this framework, men and women rarely interacted as equals. Women were trained to defer, to avoid eye contact, to shrink into the background. Even in workplaces, interaction with men outside immediate authority was minimal and formal. Imagine, then, their arrival at Allied camps. Nurses, clerks, and administrators, men and women, moving freely, sharing tables, laughing at small jokes, helping one another across gender lines. Meals were communal, conversations casual, roles interchangeable. A Japanese prisoner watching from the edge of the mess tent saw an alien world in miniature. It was not just social disobedience, it was a moral inversion. What they had been taught was sinful. Equality, freedom, Even kindness from the enemy was now visible, undeniable. Diaries recovered post-war describe hesitation before taking food from male hands. Some sat rigidly, hands folded, waiting for permission that never came. One nurse later recalled, "I did not understand how they could smile at men and eat with them. It felt wrong. Yet, somehow it was right." This cultural dissonance was profound. It challenged everything they believed about honor, gender, and the nature of the enemy. Embedded within this shock was a more intimate struggle, the question of personal and national honor. Many of these women have been trained to value death over capture. Suicide, or at the very least strict resistance, was expected of every soldier and auxiliary. The act of surrender, of eating in captivity, or receiving care from the enemy, violated a lifetime of indoctrination. In practice, this manifested in extreme self-discipline. Women would rise before dawn, polish uniforms, fold bedding meticulously, and avoid the gaze of men, even among fellow prisoners. Food was taken in minimal portions. Conversation was kept to a whisper. Shame was omnipresent, a silent companion to every breath. Allied records note that some women refused medical treatment until illness became life-threatening. One Australian camp report observed, "They will not allow themselves to be weak in front of us. Their fear is not of death, but of dishonor." Here, the tension between survival and ideology became central. Some women reconciled slowly, learning that survival did not erase honor. Others never fully adjusted, returning to Japan carrying the stigma of being alive when their empire had demanded death. From the perspective of the Allies, the presence of female Japanese prisoners posed unique challenges. Camps had been designed for male combatants, with limited attention to privacy, sanitation, and medical care for women. Yet, officers and medics adapted. They established separate wards, provided appropriate clothing, and emphasized dignity. The intent was not merely adherence to the Geneva Conventions. Many Allied personnel, particularly nurses, saw these women as victims of ideology, not enemies. Food was offered gently, medicine administered with explanation, language taught patiently. Occasionally, a Japanese woman would be allowed to assist in the infirmary, learning skills that blurred the line between prisoner and collaborator. These acts of care were profoundly disorienting for the captives. A nurse who had fled Manila described her astonishment. "I was afraid to touch them. I expected them to curse me, to bow constantly, to hide their faces. Instead, they watched, wary but accepting, and I felt no fear." The very act of receiving care, of participating in shared labor, became a form of moral confrontation. They were forced to recognize humanity outside the rigid confines of loyalty to the emperor. The combination of cultural shock, imposed discipline, and unexpected compassion produced a pervasive sense of psychological disorientation. Women who had memorized propaganda about the savagery of Americans, the dishonor of surrender, and the sanctity of male authority now faced contradictory evidence every day. Some experienced physical manifestations of stress, insomnia, nausea, and withdrawal. Others became hyper-observant, noting the smallest gestures. A male nurse offering a cup of tea to a female patient, the casual laughter of men and women sharing a table. In private diaries, a few questioned their previous beliefs for the first time. This mental upheaval was intensified by isolation from home and uncertainty about the war's outcome. Rumors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached some camps by August 1945, further destabilizing their worldview. Death, defeat, and unconditional mercy collided in ways that had no precedent in their experience. These four angles, cultural, honor-based, humanitarian, and psychological, intersected daily in the camp. Each meal, each routine task, became a test of comprehension and adaptation. The Japanese women began to observe carefully, to measure, to question. By September 1945, these threads would converge toward a single, defining moment, a meal in which men and women ate together freely. It was simple, almost banal, but for these captives, it represented the collapse of a world they had been taught was eternal. As the weeks in the camps passed, the initial shock gave way to deeper reflection, adaptation, and confrontation with reality. The Japanese women prisoners were caught in a liminal space between the values instilled in them by decades of imperial indoctrination and the unexpected freedoms of their captors. Section 2 explores additional angles: the psychological disorientation, faith in survival, and the documentation of these encounters. Psychological disorientation, the collapse of certainty. For women raised under the Japanese wartime code, the world was predictable and absolute. Men commanded, women obeyed. Life was duty, death was honor. The enemy was inherently monstrous. In captivity, these absolutes dissolved. In one Australian camp, a group of women were observed hesitating at the mess hall doorway. Inside, Allied soldiers and nurses spoke freely, smiled at each other, and ate together. A simple act of pouring coffee for a male soldier caused several of the prisoners to recoil. For the first time, the idea that a man could treat a woman with equality, without threat or dominance, seemed real. Many diaries recount similar internal struggles. One nurse wrote, "I do not understand their world. They are not cruel. They do not bow. They do not scream. Yet I feel fear, not of them, but of myself, for I cannot decide what is right." The fear was existential. It was not death they faced, but the unraveling of a lifetime of belief. This mental disorientation was compounded by the gradual realization that the war was over, that Japan had lost, and that their emperor, once a living god, had surrendered. For the first time, captives were forced to reconcile survival with honor. Faith and survival, adaptation under observation. Despite shock and disorientation, the women developed coping mechanisms. Faith, both spiritual and ideological, remained a cornerstone, though it shifted from blind obedience to practical survival. Some prayed silently before meals, not out of ritual obedience, but in search of inner strength. Others observed carefully, learning the camp's routines, memorizing schedules, and discovering small freedoms they had never imagined. Language acquisition became an unexpected survival tool. A few women picked up English phrases, enough to communicate basic needs and understand instructions. They learned to interact with medics, to ask for food, to navigate camp hierarchy. The act of learning itself, breaking the barrier of communication, offered a subtle empowerment. These adaptations were not uniform. Some women embraced them slowly, tentatively accepting kindness and equality. Others remained rigid, clinging to the notion that survival should not compromise honor. In private letters sent after repatriation, a few admitted that they had envied the casual liberty of Allied women. The laughter, the choice, the ability to exist without fear of perpetual shame. Documentation, recording the clash of worlds. Allied personnel, recognizing the unprecedented nature of these female prisoners, documented their experiences extensively. Camp reports noted not only physical condition, but also behavior, emotional state, and cultural response. One U.S. Army report from Leyte Island stated, "The women exhibit extreme deference, but also curiosity. They watch our routines closely, noting interactions between men and women. Their responses suggest deep cognitive dissonance, as if the boundaries of propriety they knew have been removed." These documents are corroborated by post-war interviews. A Japanese clerk recalled, "We were watched, but also cared for. We cannot understand why. Every gesture, every word was confusing. I remember thinking, are these people truly our enemies?" Medical reports noted the physical toll of prolonged malnutrition, malaria, and exhaustion, yet also recorded gradual improvement under Allied care. This juxtaposition, severe suffering met with unexpected humanity, became a recurring theme, illustrating that the most transformative aspects of captivity were not military, but moral and psychological. The social experiment, observation and integration. Camps effectively became laboratories in human behavior. Japanese women, steeped in a culture of hierarchy and fear, were forced to observe a social model they had never encountered. Men and women sharing tasks, meals, and leisure on equal footing. One striking instance recorded in Australian archives describes a Japanese nurse hesitating to sit at a table alongside male POWs. A female Allied nurse invited her, gently gesturing to an empty seat. The Japanese woman paused for several minutes, then, trembling, joined. By sharing a meal, she inadvertently participated in the collapse of an entire ideological construct. The belief that men and women must never engage as equals outside rigid authority. It was a quiet revolution. Each act, sharing food, walking unaccompanied in the camp, speaking freely, chipped away at the walls of indoctrination. These were not public spectacles, but private awakenings, observed by captors and fellow prisoners alike. Intersection of angles, the human dimension. Taken together, the angles reveal a complex reality. Cultural shock, honor, humanitarian treatment, psychological disorientation, adaptation, and careful observation all interacted to produce an environment unlike any in modern military history. These women were not soldiers facing battle. They were human beings confronting the fragility of belief under the microscope of a foreign culture. The most ordinary acts, drinking tea, passing bread, sitting at a table, became profound moral encounters. They highlighted the tension between the collapse of an empire and the persistence of human dignity. By observing men and women eat together, laugh together, and care for one another, the prisoners were forced to confront a reality that neither propaganda nor indoctrination could erase. And as the war approached its final, decisive weeks, this quiet confrontation would crescendo into moments of clarity and transformation, leading to the climactic realization that would define their captivity. The summer of 1945 brought the war to its catastrophic finale. Across the Pacific, Allied forces advanced with unrelenting precision. The Philippines, long a battleground of ambushes and jungle warfare, had fallen under American control. Japanese forces were retreating into isolated pockets, cut off from supply, reinforcements, or hope. For the women prisoners scattered across the camps of Leyte, Luzon, and nearby islands, the news was both incomprehensible and inevitable. Japan was losing. Rumors reached them of massive destruction on their home islands. Tokyo firebombed, Hiroshima and Nagasaki devastated by atomic bombs. The word surrender, whispered through the camp corridors, carried a weight that no propaganda could contain. Inside the camps, daily life had been painstakingly organized to maintain order, But the arrival of this news fractured even the strictest routines. Women who had once stood at attention, refusing food and bending under the weight of shame, now trembled with disbelief. Some fainted upon hearing of the bombings. Others broke into tears that could not be concealed. The psychological disorientation they had experienced in small increments now exploded. One nurse in Leyte described it later. "We have been trained to die. To surrender was shame. To live was a sin. And yet, here we were alive, listening to the voices from our homeland telling us everything was over." The turning point was not only psychological, but also deeply human. In the mess halls, the women began to notice something that had been happening quietly over weeks. Allied men and women eating together, laughing, sharing news, and offering food without hierarchy or fear. A male soldier passed bread to a female nurse. A female clerk poured coffee for a man returning from a duty shift. To the Japanese captives, these gestures were both alien and profoundly disarming. The moment crystallized in August 1945, when the surrender of Japan was officially announced. Radio broadcasts of Emperor Hirohito's voice reached the camps, his tone solemn, weary, almost incomprehensible to the prisoners. Many could not believe the words. The divine emperor had declared surrender, something previously unthinkable. Within the POW camps, reactions were immediate and intense. Women clutched their uniforms, bowing instinctively even to the air. Some wept openly, unable to reconcile loyalty with survival. Others stood motionless, eyes fixed on the Allied soldiers, seeking comprehension in the expressions of those they had been taught to hate. It was during these days that the significance of the shared meals became undeniable. A Japanese nurse, previously rigid with shame, allowed herself to sit at a table alongside a male and female Allied nurse. She accepted a cup of tea, her hand shaking. Across the table, a soldier smiled, unaware of the monumental cultural significance of the gesture. For the first time, a human connection transcended ideology. This simple act, eating together, represented the collapse of an entire worldview. In the Japanese training manuals, the enemy was savage, men were gods, women were silent, and surrender was unthinkable. Here, under the tropical sun of Leyte, every assumption unraveled. In medical wards, similar breakthroughs occurred. Injured women received care from Allied nurses of both genders. They witnessed men and women performing the same duties, offering empathy, guidance, and instruction without hierarchy. Slowly, some began to respond in kind, assisting, learning, speaking. Every small interaction eroded the rigid structures of shame and obedience. Yet this transformation was not universal. Some women clung to the old code, refusing to speak, eat, or accept care. For them, surrender remained a moral catastrophe. Others hesitated at every step, uncertain whether adaptation constituted betrayal. Still, the turning point was unmistakable. A seed had been planted. The rigid world of duty and hierarchy was giving way, moment by moment, to observation, empathy, and survival. Beyond individual transformation, the camps themselves changed. Guards and administrators began to recognize the unique psychological needs of female prisoners. Mess halls were reorganized to encourage interaction, while medics offered language lessons and hygiene guidance. Every routine, from laundry to medical checks, became an opportunity for prisoners to experience equality and agency for the first time. In essence, the final weeks of the war became a crucible. Japanese women, trained to revere authority, fear the enemy, and prioritize honor over life, were confronted with a new reality. a world where men and women could exist side by side, sharing work, meals, and respect. By the time Japan's surrender was formally ratified on September 2nd, 1945, the transformation was undeniable. The women had survived the physical trials of war. More importantly, they had survived the psychological and cultural trials that accompany captivity. In the simple, shared acts of daily life, eating, talking, assisting, they glimpsed a world previously unimaginable. And in this world, the war was over, but understanding was only beginning. September 1945 arrived with a tense, almost surreal calm. The guns of the Pacific were silent. Ships still patrolled the waters, but the decisive battles were over. The Japanese women prisoners, once bound by duty and indoctrination, now faced a reality that demanded comprehension rather than obedience. In camps across Luzon, Leyte, and New Guinea, the women gathered in small groups, whispering, observing, and tentatively interacting with Allied staff. Some had begun to memorize English phrases, enough to ask simple questions: food more, or doctor, help? These small acts of communication, previously inconceivable, marked the first cracks in the barrier of fear and shame. The shared meals became symbolic theaters of transformation. A single mess hall in Leyte recorded a moment repeated across multiple camps. A Japanese nurse, her uniform immaculate, was offered a seat beside male and female Allied nurses. She hesitated, eyes downcast, hands clasped. The senior Allied nurse gestured gently. After several minutes, she lowered herself onto the bench. Bread was passed, tea poured. Conversation was minimal but human. A quiet recognition passed between them. Hierarchy and fear no longer dictated the rules. This scene, though simple, represented a profound moral and psychological turning point. It demonstrated the collapse of the imperial worldview, the belief that men and women must remain separated, that the enemy was inherently evil, that surrender was shameful. All of these assumptions were being contradicted by a cup of tea, a shared loaf of bread, a smile offered without expectation. Elsewhere, similar moments unfolded in hospital wards. Women who had been too disciplined to accept care now allowed medics to treat wounds, administer medication, and teach basic hygiene. They observed the care men and women offered each other freely, and slowly began to mirror it. Acts of mutual aid, once unimaginable, became routine. The psychological disorientation of the early weeks evolved into cautious curiosity. Diaries preserved by Japanese women reveal a spectrum of reactions: wonder, confusion, relief, and even admiration. One nurse wrote, "I've been told the enemy was cruel, yet I see hands that heal. I have been taught shame, yet I am allowed to eat. I do not yet understand, but I feel something like freedom." Freedom, however, was not unqualified. The prisoners were still captives, still under armed watch, and still outsiders in an alien culture. But within this paradox, safety combined with autonomy, they began to see an alternative to the rigid, fearful obedience they had always known. The turning point extended beyond the individual. It became social. Japanese women, once isolated in fear, began interacting with each other in new ways, exchanging small gestures of solidarity, sharing water, offering blankets, helping one another in the infirmary. They observed Allied men and women, and gradually, the behaviors filtered through the prisoners' own interactions. Rules that had once seemed eternal. The separation of sexes, the unyielding obedience to hierarchy, the inflexibility of honor, were now negotiable. This transformation also highlighted a moral dimension for the Allies. Officers and medics observed the prisoners' hesitation, understanding that their actions, simple, human, egalitarian, were reshaping deeply entrenched beliefs. Every shared meal, every gentle instruction, every smile became an unspoken lesson. Compassion can dismantle the strictest codes of indoctrination. By the end of September 1945, as repatriation efforts began, the impact of these months was clear. Women who had arrived fearful, silent, and rigid were leaving with a tentative awareness of choice, of agency, and of a human connection that transcended gender, rank, or nationality. The war had ended militarily, but in these camps, a quieter, more profound conflict had been resolved. The conflict between indoctrination and lived experience, between fear and understanding. The symbolic meal, men and women eating together, remained a lasting memory for many. One former clerk recalled in a post-war interview, "I cannot forget that day. We sat, they smiled, we ate. It was ordinary, yet nothing had ever been so extraordinary. I realized our world had been smaller than it needed to be." In essence, the climax of their captivity was not a battle or a surrender in the traditional sense. It was a moment of moral revelation. A simple act of equality, offered without coercion, taught a lesson that decades of propaganda could not. As the Japanese women prepared to leave the camps and return home, they carried not only the physical scars of war, but also the indelible imprint of this cultural and emotional turning point. They had survived, adapted, and observed a new model of human interaction, one in which hierarchy could be relaxed and fear could be replaced with mutual respect. The surrender of Japan in September 1945 marked the official end of hostilities, but for the women who had been held in Allied camps, the consequences of captivity extended far beyond the battlefield. Their return to civilian life would be shaped as much by culture and ideology as by the physical realities of war. Repatriation began slowly. Allied authorities, mindful of the Geneva Conventions, organized transport back to Japan via ships and planes. Conditions were crowded, but far safer than the chaotic retreats they had previously endured. Women who had once faced starvation, disease, and constant threat of death now traveled under guard, but with basic provisions and care. Many kept to themselves, quietly reflecting on the months of their captivity, on the small acts of kindness and shared humanity they had witnessed. Upon arrival in Japan, the transition was jarring. Cities lay in ruins. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and others reduced to rubble. The nation itself was physically and morally exhausted. For the returning women, the contrast between the humanized treatment in Allied camps and the devastation at home was stark. They had been spared, tended to, and treated with respect abroad, yet their homeland was a landscape of death, grief, and ideological collapse. Social reintegration posed another challenge. Captured Japanese women often faced suspicion, scorn, or outright hostility. Society had been taught that surrender was dishonorable, that loyalty required death over captivity. Many families and communities viewed returnees with shame. Women who had been nurses or clerks under the imperial military were sometimes questioned about their actions in captivity. Those who had accepted food, medical care, or assistance from Allied personnel were judged harshly, accused of weakness or betrayal. At the same time, some women found solace in the connections formed in captivity. Shared experiences, even with the enemy, had created a quiet resilience. Diaries and letters recovered later reveal women recounting small details. A shared cup of tea, a kind word from a nurse, a hand offered without expectation. These moments became anchors of memory, proof that survival need not compromise humanity. Allied reports highlighted the remarkable adaptability of these prisoners. Australian and American camp administrators noted that, over time, women became more willing to communicate, assist in daily routines, and accept medical care. By the time of repatriation, many had acquired basic English phrases, developed new social skills, and learned to navigate a more egalitarian environment. In effect, the camps had provided both refuge and a subtle education in cultural flexibility. For historians, the aftermath reveals a dual narrative: the physical and psychological endurance of the prisoners and the quiet moral impact of humane treatment in captivity. The war had stripped them of their homeland, their certainty, and, in some ways, their previously unquestioned ideology. But it had also given them a window into an alternative mode of living, a world where cooperation, equality, and human dignity could exist even amidst the ruins of conflict. This period also laid the groundwork for broader post-war shifts. As Japan entered the American occupation, women's roles began to evolve. The experience of survival in Allied camps, coupled with exposure to more egalitarian practices, influenced perspectives on gender, authority, and social structure. Though the transition was gradual and uneven, seeds planted in captivity would later contribute to the post-war transformation of Japanese society. The first section of the aftermath ends with a sense of fragile continuity. The women had survived, yes, but their greatest challenge lay ahead: reintegrating into a nation that revered honor above life, into a society devastated by war, and into a culture that would not easily understand the lessons learned in captivity. Returning to Japan, the women faced a world both familiar and alien. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, and families fractured by loss. The physical devastation mirrored the collapse of the ideology that had governed their lives. The Emperor's surrender broadcast had not only ended the war, but shattered long-held beliefs about honor, duty, and the role of women. For many, reintegration into family and society was emotionally fraught. Communities that had remained isolated from the realities of defeat often regarded returning women with suspicion. Survivors of captivity were viewed as tarnished. Their acceptance of food, medical care, or even the sight of Allied personnel interpreted as weakness or dishonor. Some families cut ties, others offered only begrudging welcome. Despite this, the women carried experiences that quietly transformed them. The months spent observing Allied social structures, men and women working and eating together, freely exchanging ideas and responsibilities, had left an indelible imprint. Diaries and memoirs reveal that, even in silence, many reflected on these differences. I saw how they lived. It was strange, yes, but also humane. Perhaps there is a life beyond fear. This exposure to an alternative societal model, however limited, planted seeds that would later influence Japan's post-war reconstruction. Women who had been trained to obey, without question, now understood, for the first time, that they could exercise judgment, interact across gender lines, and navigate daily life with a degree of autonomy. The practical consequences of captivity were evident as well. Women returned with health restored, though scars, both physical and psychological, remained. Many had learned basic hygiene, medical skills, or administrative practices that they could apply at home. These skills were unexpectedly valuable in a society attempting to rebuild from total devastation. Culturally, the experiences of these women challenged entrenched norms. The Allied model of shared responsibility and equality had demonstrated a functional alternative to rigid hierarchy. While Japan's post-war occupation enforced legal and social reforms, the first-hand observations of women prisoners offered a human example of how these changes could operate in practice. It was subtle, yet deeply influential for those who survived the camps. On a personal level, memories of simple acts, shared meals, casual conversation, gestures of kindness remained vivid. The shock of seeing men and women eat together, once unimaginable, became a reference point for reflection on life, authority, and human dignity. For some, this quietly reshaped their understanding of relationships and social interaction. Others carried a lingering tension, caught between ingrained cultural expectations and the lived reality of egalitarian treatment. Reports compiled by Allied authorities after repatriation documented these outcomes. Many women expressed surprise at the disparity between their expectations of cruelty and the actual treatment they received. One Australian officer summarized, "The women adapted more quickly than anticipated. Their observation of our routines and gradual participation in daily life revealed a capacity for adjustment that exceeded our expectations. They will return home altered, not only in health, but in perspective." The aftermath also underscores a broader historical lesson. The war had forced a confrontation between two radically different cultural paradigms. In the camp, small, humane acts, a shared cup of tea, a smile, a conversation across gender lines, dismantled decades of indoctrination more effectively than any battlefield encounter. For these women, the collapse of the empire was not only a political event, but a personal awakening to alternative possibilities. As they reintegrated, some faced lingering guilt for surviving, some struggled to reconcile captivity with honor, and others quietly carried forward lessons in human equality and resilience. Across these personal narratives, a common thread emerges. The war had ended, yet its most enduring impact on these women was the transformation of perception, values, and social understanding. The consequences of these experiences would echo quietly through post-war Japan. The collapse of rigid hierarchies, the example of shared responsibility, and the proof that women could survive, adapt, and even influence outcomes would later resonate as the country rebuilt itself, both physically and morally. From this quiet resilience and transformation, the story moves naturally into its reflection/closure, the calm, philosophical consideration of what these events meant for history, humanity, and the understanding of cultural collision. In the quiet aftermath of war, the significance of the Japanese women's experience in Allied camps transcends the immediate events of captivity. It was not bullets, bombs, or formal surrender that transformed them, but the subtle, human acts of equality and care. The shared meals, the gentle instructions, the simple acknowledgement of their humanity. These moments dismantled an entire worldview, one built on hierarchy, fear, and unyielding obedience, revealing that survival and dignity need not be mutually exclusive. For decades, these women have been trained to equate surrender with shame, compliance with weakness, and the enemy with irredeemable evil. In the camps, each small act, a man passing a loaf of bread to a woman, a nurse treating a wound without expectation, a conversation across gender lines, became a living contradiction of every doctrine they had internalized. The shock they experienced was not merely cultural. It was moral, emotional, and profoundly human. Their story illuminates a broader truth about history, that transformation often occurs not only on the battlefield, but in the quiet spaces of daily life, through observation, empathy, and human connection. The war ended with treaties, surrenders, and political realignments, but the collapse of indoctrination, the reshaping of perception, and the awakening to human equality happened at mess tables, in medical wards, and in the shared routines of captivity. These women returned to a Japan in ruins, carrying both the scars of conflict and the seeds of change. Their experience foreshadowed the gradual social transformation of post-war Japan, the expansion of women's roles, and the subtle reshaping of cultural norms. More than that, it reminds us that the simplest acts, a meal shared, a hand offered, a smile given without expectation, can resonate across ideologies, breaking down walls erected by fear, propaganda, and rigid tradition. In the end, their story is not one of defeat or victory alone, but of human resilience and the quiet, enduring power of dignity. History often celebrates battles, strategies, and leaders, but sometimes the most profound victories occur at the level of the human heart, in moments that seem small, yet reveal the possibility of a world rebuilt on empathy, understanding, and shared humanity. And in that light, the memory of Japanese women watching men and women eat together becomes more than an anecdote. It becomes a lens through which we can see the fragility of ideology, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring hope for a world where equality and compassion guide the most ordinary of acts.